Hey, what's up, Push Kids? We're back for our last lecture in Period 5. Today we have topic 5.11, the end of Reconstruction. Our learning objective today is 5L, explain how and why Reconstruction resulted in continuity and change in regional and national understandings of what it meant to be an American. So, to kind of really get us caught up, Reconstruction was difficult to maintain as Democrats slowly took back control over southern states. And we're going to kind of explain how this concept will take place over the next few slides. That leads us to key idea number 1. Southern plantation owners are going to continue to own the majority of the region's land, even after Reconstruction. Former slaves sought land ownership, but generally fell short of self-sufficiency, as an exploitative and soil-intensive sharecropping system limited blacks and poor whites' access to land in the South. Now, the Civil War had ended slavery. The 13th Amendment had taken care of that. However, African Americans had little job training or money for farmland. Now, in the South, with few other options, most ex-slaves returned to the plantation to work, many of them going to the very plantations upon which they had been working and living their entire lives. Now, after this Civil War, slavery is now going to be replaced by a system known as sharecropping, sometimes also referred to as tenant farming. And it is in this system that many former slaves and also poor whites are going to be working in. So to understand exactly kind of what happens in this sharecropping system, we're going to walk you through the image that's on the screen right here, known as the sharecropper cycle of poverty. Now, the way this entire system works is white landowners, what they would do is they would rent parcels or sections of their fields to blacks in exchange for sometimes as much as a half and as maybe as little as a quarter of the cotton that they produced upon that particular land. However, the tenants, because they had no money for tools, seed, or really anything else, what they had to do is they had to gain loans from the landowner in exchange for more of their cotton, known as the crop lien system. And so what they would do is that you already owe, a quarter or a half of all of your crop just to access the land. And now you've got to get your tools, your seed, anything else you might need, food, clothing, whatever else, and you're taking that out. And you're getting that from the landowner because they're the ones that actually have cash and capital. They can acquire those items for you, but you're getting it out on a loan. Now, what would happen next is that the sharecropper would work the entire year. They would harvest their crop, and then they would sell it. But they wouldn't sell it on the open market to the highest bidder. In fact, they would be locked into selling that crop to the landowner who could control the price. And because they can control the price, essentially what they could do is they could make sure that the sharecropper never earned a profit or rarely would be able to earn a profit on their particular spot of land. Now, many southern states had passed laws that prevented sharecroppers from being able to leave their particular plantations if they owned a debt. And so what the landowner could essentially do is they could essentially be able to keep this black workforce on that same plantation by essentially keeping them in this cycle of poverty. Now, by the end of 1865, most freedmen had returned to work on the same plantations upon which they were previously enslaved. And they stayed there for generations. Sharecropping remained in place in much of the South well into the 1940s, nearly 100 years later. Which then leads us to our second key idea, which says that segregation, violence, Supreme Court decisions, and local political tactics progressively stripped away African American rights. But the 14th and 15th Amendments eventually became the basis for court decisions upholding civil rights in the 20th century. Now, as we've already mentioned, many Southern governments had resisted Reconstruction by passing black codes. Now, black codes did many things. Black codes restricted blacks from serving on juries, testifying against whites in court, marrying whites, owning land. Oftentimes, these laws restricted black workers as well from gaining skilled jobs or competing against the white workforce. Black men could be forced to serve, forced essentially into a version of slavery as punishment for a crime or not paying back debts that they owed. Many of these laws remained on the books well into the 1900s. For instance, such as laws against blacks and whites marrying each other continued in places such as Virginia all the way up until the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Now, in addition to this, the Supreme Court and court systems also helped to undermine Reconstruction. The Supreme Court, for instance, ruled against many civil rights laws that were designed to protect African Americans. For instance, 1873 in the slaughterhouse cases, which are probably the most famous, most civil rights were ruled to be state rather than federal rights, and therefore unprotected by the 14th Amendment. Now, in addition to laws such as black codes and the work of the Supreme Court, in addition to this, the Southerners also at this time used intimidation and violence to try and keep African Americans inferior to whites. Now, the most famous group of this is the Ku Klux Klan, and they were first formed during Reconstruction to attack blacks who tried to vote and tried to challenge white supremacy. Their tactics were to often use violence, most famously lynching, which is defined as murder by mob, became much more common. And so what we saw is that Southerners supported the return of the Democratic Party to state governments. Black codes and the Klan successfully limited black voting throughout the South. And black voting, as we learned in our previous lesson, had led to African Americans being elected not only in statewide offices, but also to federal positions as well, such as in Congress. In addition to this, federal troops in the southern military districts oftentimes had difficulty protecting African Americans. And so one by one, what we started to see was southern state governments are going to start to shift control from the Republican Party back to the Democratic Party. And by 1873, this is when the entire South will once again be controlled by conservative Democratic governments throughout the South. Now, these Redeemer Democrats are going to hope to restore the old South. And in the chart is really kind of interesting to see, because what you see in the red line right there is you see the number of Republicans that are elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. Now, South Carolina is really an interesting state to look at. All right, and that's because South Carolina was a majority-minority state. And what I mean by that is that there were more African Americans living in South Carolina than there were whites. And so it would make sense then that African Americans, who were predominantly Republican voters, almost exclusively Republican voters at this time, that's because the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. It's the party of the radical Republicans. It's the party of the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It makes sense that African Americans are going to vote Republican at this time. And we can see that early on, they should dominate the entire, South Carolina House of Representatives. And they do. After that passage of the Reconstruction Act, which had granted voting rights to Southern blacks in state elections, we can see that African Americans and Republicans dominate that California House of Representatives. But you can see that that number starts to fall off. After 1874, we see this radical shift, all right, between the number of Republicans elected and the number of Democrats that are elected. And that's because African Americans were going to be denied the right to vote, thanks to local laws that are passed, thanks to the Supreme Court not enforcing, as well as intimidation by groups like the KKK. Therefore, by the mid-1870s, the Democratic Party is going to return to power in most southern states. And the only thing protecting blacks in the South were federal troops. This is all going to come to the end in 1876, in the election of 1876. Now, in the election of 1876, which is one of the closest elections we've had in U.S. history, the two people running for president were the Democratic candidate Samuel S. Tilden, who had become really famous for persecuting corruption in the Grant administration. He was actually from New York City. And the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, who was from the state of Ohio. Now, neither one of them won a majority of the electoral vote. In fact, they tied in the electoral vote. And in fact, Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate, had actually received more total votes, or more what we call popular votes, than Tilden did. And so the election, whenever this happens, the process is that it then goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, each state gets one vote. Now, the House of Representatives was also split. And so then it's going to go to a committee within the House of Representatives. There's a committee of 9 members. And in that committee of 9 members, there was 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats, which means that Rutherford B. Hayes was going to become the next president of the United States. The problem was, though, is that many Southerners especially saw this election in very similar views that of the election of 1860. Tilden had received more votes, Hayes wasn't really their president, and there was even calls for secession once again. This is a person that doesn't represent me, the South was saying at this particular time. And so what we're going to need is we're going to need a compromise. And so the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress are going to agree to what is called the Compromise of 1877. And this Compromise of 1877, which is sometimes referred to as the Second Corrupt Bargain. And it's called that because this is a terrible bargain for African Americans in the South. And so the Democrats, what they're going to agree to is they're going to vote for Hayes as president. They're going to, and if not voting for him, they're at least going to accept him as president. However, the federal troops are going to be removed from the South. And when this happens, when President Hayes removes the federal troops from the South in 1877, Reconstruction will officially end. Now, when Reconstruction ends in 1877, an era called the Jim Crow era will begin, and it lasts from 1877 all the way up until 1954. These Jim Crow laws are going to segregate Southern society and restrict blacks from voting, with things such as poll taxes and literacy tests become the 2 biggest restrictions that you need to know about. Well, that ends our lecture for today, and that's our last lecture for this particular unit. Today, what we covered how Reconstruction unraveled during the Grant administration and how African Americans had consistently their rights taken away from them. Their economic rights through the sharecropping and crop lien systems, and their political rights were stripped away from them through things such as black codes, Supreme Court cases, and violent groups such as the KKK, all ending with everything ending after the Second Corrupt Bargain, the Compromise of 1877, after the election of 1876. Well, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. And until next time, go Pack.